Today's discussion will be presented in 3 sections since we are recording it for a radio broadcast on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. You're welcome to post questions and comments during this session and we'll try to answer them online. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Jason Miller, Executive Editor of Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.
Welcome to the discussion. Our guests today are Greg Garcia, the Chief Information Officer of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Dr. Ray Latier, the Marine Corps' Chief of Cybersecurity Division C4 Department, Paul Morris, the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer for the Transportation Security Administration, and Matt Alderman, the Vice President of Strategy for Tenable Network Security. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Great to be here.
Before we get started, let me set some context for our discussion. Over the past 20 years, some would say the specific approach to cybersecurity taken by the government, by industry, has been short-sighted. The defense-in-depth approach is broken, according to some experts. They say it creates a false sense of security. It depends too much on endpoint solutions for different layers of the network. And then in the end, it creates gaps, and that's where hackers hide and eventually breach the network and take the data. The SANS Institute in 2012 called defense-in-depth unsustainable and provides no assurances that the enemy can be removed from the network permanently once they are inside. SANS says this concept of defense in depth came from the kinetic world, where you can have, for instance, multiple fire alarms, extinguishers, evacuation plans in case of a fire. But in the cyber world, this concept didn't transfer like many thought it would. So the big question is, and this is what the panel is going to try to answer today, how do we fix that? Well, over the last 7 years, we know the Office of Management and Budget has been trying to push agencies toward continuous monitoring, the use of risk management. This is the idea of understanding your network, your data, and then recognizing those risks associated with what happens if you lose that data, if you lose control of those networks, and then making informed decisions about how best to protect those assets. Take the recent update for Circular A130. That addresses this idea head on, calling for agencies to implement an agency-wide risk management framework that frames, assesses, responds to, monitors information security and privacy risk on an ongoing basis across all 3 tiers: organization, mission, and of course information systems levels. The other key piece to this continuous monitoring and risk-based approach is automation. That is where the Homeland Security Department's Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation, or CDM program, comes in. Experts say CDM tools will help agencies know where their vulnerabilities are and know them more quickly and automatically address the problem and let information security officers know what's going on. Agencies are making progress toward this continuous monitoring risk-based approach, but it's taking time and hackers are exploiting gaps in the system. So what can agencies and other organizations do to quicken the pace of cyber change? Well, that's what our panel is going to discuss today. Once again, our guests are Greg Garcia, the Chief Information Officer for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Dr. Ray Latier, the Marine Corps' Chief of Cybersecurity Division, C4 Department, Paul Morris, the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer for the Transportation Security Administration, and Matt Alderman, the Vice President of Strategy for Tenable Network Security. Let me turn to the panel and start with the simple question. The approach to cybersecurity, that is a lot of discussion about, has to be more holistic. So I'm going to start with Ray over at the Marine Corps, since you have cyber in your name. Let's start there. How do you deal with that cybersecurity approach?
Well, it's interesting as you talked about the approach of the defense in depth issue and saying that that particular part seems to be too static and broken. I kind of agree with that to a point, and it's because a lot of people just take that at one particular point in time and say, here, I've done it, I've established it, I've turned it on, and then I leave it go. Problem is that that's not really working defense in depth the way it's supposed to be. You've got to go back and relook at it. You've got to keep a watch on it. A great example you also gave, it's like where people thought that, well, we're going to take and just do fire alarms and just let the fire alarms work. Well, in many cases, you need to do more than just the fire alarms. You need to have people walking around to see if the alarm is working. You may have somebody has to go make sure that the electronics are working. I mean, there's different layers of approaches on this. I personally find that I think some people misunderstood, and still to this day misunderstand, how to do defense in depth, and I also think they misunderstand the approach of how to do what's called that risk management framework. We've always had it. I'm not going to go down the rat hole yet of talking too much about what certification accreditation meant and all this as it grew from it, but the foundations are there. And it's a solid effort, and I think if we just take a look and modernize it a little bit, that we could make a lot of progress.
Paul, from your perspective, being at the Homeland Security Department, you were among the first of the guinea pigs, if you will, testing out the CDM program, moving from this, if you will, every 3-year static to this more holistic, this more continuous monitoring approach. Tell us TSA's experience.
I think that's absolutely how you say it. We've started to migrate a number of our FSMA systems into what's called an ongoing authorization. And instead of, as you described, every 3 years we wait and for looking for a surprise is going to happen of we haven't been paying attention to the architecture, we don't know how it changes. What are the things going on in that system? Because we are a system of systems approach, and you have to take a holistic view across the enterprise, which is one of the things that we're trying to raise. And you need to look at those systems individually, but they all are connecting to each other. We've got partners outside of TSA, we've got systems within TSA that connect to each other and share data, systems and users. So who are they? And it gets back to the single question of you have to know what you have before you protect it, and that's driving what we do. I'd also say that this whole effort, it cuts across all of our lines of business. Our biggest effort to increase that holistic view is to get everybody else involved, whether it's an acquisition project, somebody out there wanting a new system. We've got to be a part of that discussion now, framing the requirements so that when it shows up, we pivot from this bolt-on versus where we want to be a part of the solution as it's provided through to O&M.
So, Greg, I'm going to turn back to you for a second because we have 2 security officers telling you what it should be. You're the CIO. You have to make some of these bigger decisions because the mission people come in and say, but, so talk about your view of holistic security.
I think the comments are accurate, but I think the thing you have to add on to that is this is really now shifting from the IT focus to a commander focus. We can do all the IT systems that we want, but if it's not a commander focus, it's not going to get the priority, the funding, the resources that's required to do this holistic approach. So the thing that you'll see is the shift to, it used to be you'd codify your cyber risk and you present it to a commander, and the commander would just say, okay, great, I'm willing to accept that, without really understanding what they're accepting. So I think part of this education is commanders understanding what risk is and what risk can do to their missions, and really making cyber equal with operations. I think that I've seen that probably over the last 2 years make that parity of cyber is equal with operations, because when you ignore cyber, it's really an operational peril. The other thing I'd like to comment is it's really everyone's responsibility to be a cyber warrior. So that's the person sitting at the terminal. So the days of, hey, I'm in the cyber department, so I worry about cyber is, I think, on the fleeting end of that, it's everyone in your organization has to be aware of what the cyber challenge is and what good cyber behavior is, because as we saw last summer, it's an individual decision to do things on the network that can really break down this defense in depth. So really, commanders got to have a view and understand and take the risk, and everyone in the consumption chain has to be involved and understand that cyber is their job too.
And in many ways, it seems like that's part of that holistic approach that we're trying to get to here, is this concept that it's not just Ray's problem or Paul's problem, but it goes from the CIO all the way down to the bottom rung of IT, and then all the way as wide as you can imagine across all mission areas. Is that the holistic?
Yeah, exactly. And it's really, again, you got to get it out of the IT, IM, cyber lane to the commander lane, right? So what does the commander of USACE understand about the cyber risk? That's, when I was able to talk to the new commander, I kind of informed it, if there's one thing I'd advise you of, you need to understand what the cyber risk is to your mission, civil works, military programs, or interagency work. So that's really the shift, is making someone cognizant of the operational impact and let the operational leaders decide what's an acceptable risk.
Let me turn to Matt from Tenable. This must feel a little good here, right? I mean, you guys at Tenable has been, my experts are maybe you on the opening there, saying that it's this process has been broken. Yeah. Give me a sense. You're hearing some good things.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think all the comments are right on. The concept of defense in depth isn't bad. The problem is we never connected the layers. That's where the gaps have existed in our processes, because we all chase the tool, right? We say, oh, look, all we have to do is deploy this and we'll be secure. And so that created that false sense of security. And so by creating all these layers over the years, by not connecting that data flow and all those processes, we've created these gaps ourselves. But to the other side, right, this is a business or a commander decision, right? And I think the challenge we've had as security professionals is really bridging the gap to the operational or to the business side, in this case more on the commander side in the federal government, of helping articulate what is the risk to the mission, because we're not very good at risk either as a security profession. Right? We think risk is just a CVE rating. Risk is much more involved than that, because we have to understand context of where are the critical systems, what is critical to the mission. And so if we can do a better job of connecting the layers of data, providing the context to the operational side, we can actually have a conversation about where potential risk is to the mission, and therefore figure out the best way to mitigate. And I think that's what has to continue to evolve for us to be successful.
Now, Matt, are you guys seeing this evolution happening? There's a lot of talk about continuous monitoring, automation, risk management. A130, as I quoted, is full of risk management. And it's going to take time, but do you start to see people talk in a different way?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a little bit outside and inside. In the federal space, obviously, yes, right? The risk management framework adoption, we're starting to see that evolution pick up in the different agencies. So we are definitely seeing momentum there. But even outside, when you look at the commercial side across the industry, you are also starting to see a different approach. People realize that the old model's not working, and therefore they're looking for something else. And what we've tried to do is try to educate the market is it's not about tools, it's about capabilities. And as long as you identify the appropriate capabilities needed to protect your environment, and you connect all those things together and continuously improve, it's an ongoing process, right? It's not, security's never been a project, it's a process. And if you have those capabilities, you continue to leverage them to improve your security posture, then you're in a better position than kind of a point and shoot approach, right? And so yes, you are seeing more adoption along continuous monitoring lines, as well as trying to understand the broader risk problem.
Ray, jump in.
Yeah, well, the thing is, it's interesting bringing up the aspect of risk and risk measures, and I'm really, glad we brought that up, because that's been a problem, I think, for decades. CVE ratings are one thing, but you can't come up to someone who has responsibility and say your system is a 75. They're going to look at you and say, and that means what? I think we also have to recognize too the risk issue changes over time. It's not a static environment. I may have a particular set of routers or systems at one point is very critical for a mission, but I have them at another time, those systems aren't as important. So we have to also make sure we understand this is going to shift and flow and change. Now, I heard the aspect of Greg's discussion, it's a commander issue. I say we have to determine where that commander is. Because at some point you're going to have somebody at a battalion level that some commander, lieutenant colonel may say, well, I'm going to take this risk, what really probably shouldn't, because it's going to affect others. It's got to be up at a particular level. Now I can say, throwing my point in for the Marine Corps, the commandant is actively involved in this, and he's taking responsibility in this and directing people to respond appropriately. How do we take and identify the risk in the environment? Make sure that the commanders are aware. Logistics systems are critical, for example. I don't want to have a logistics system go away that next thing you know, I'm giving you the wrong type of ammunition, I'm giving you the wrong type of jet fuel or something along that line. So, these risk parts are going to shift and change. I'm not as wedded to a commander-only approach, because CIO responsibilities are established in law. So there is that responsibility there, but CIOs have got to become more mission-focused as well. You're right, Greg, it's not the IT. The IT is a tool of the equipment we get our mission done, and we help the rest of the warfighters get their mission done as well.
Greg, jump in, because when you talk about command, let's put a finer point on it.
Sure. I guess that's really the debate is who has the authority, and certainly it's enterprise risk. But and that's really what the education part about commanders has to be, is what risk are they taking on behalf of the enterprise? Mm-hmm. They may see 200 meters out and say that's my risk, and it is, but it isn't. As you know, cyber reaches far from the foxhole to the back end server, so that entire spectrum is the cyber risk. And so, as Ray points out, is it has to be knowledgeable, and I think that's one of the things we have to do better is educating the commanders, those operators, what that risk is and what that risk entails and what the perspective of the difference is. It's not just what you see, but it's across the full spectrum. And we've got that both in critical infrastructure, in the Corps of Engineers, we really have a full spectrum of threat, right? In civil works, we have that in critical infrastructure within the United States, and we have the military programs, that risk extends beyond the United States to worldwide installations. So that's a full spectrum of what that risk is, and that's what that knowledge has to be based upon.
And going back to Ray's point, when a decision has to be made, does it go all the way up to the head of the Army Corps of Engineers? I mean, they're busy, right?
Yeah, so as Ray points out, it's my responsibility to articulate that risk, right? So I can strongly advise, I can make those recommendations to them, but at the end of the day, the mission operator has to decide. And it's my job, if that mission operator is not seeing the enterprise level, is to raise the command chain up through that process to say, maybe someone at a district level or a division level doesn't have the right perspective, and it's my responsibility to get that to the right senior commander level to make sure that that's done at the enterprise level.
Let me turn to Paul real quick, because you have a very similar challenge, but in a much different way, because TSA is dealing with not only internal, but CBP, ICE, and so many others.
I think I'd like to say that, there's been a significant wholesale change since, last summer. After the breaches and when, Tony Scott put out the Cyber Sprint directive within DHS, we had several more after that where we were given specific direction, essentially from, the secretary level of, you're going to jump in and you're going to start working in these areas. That kind of leadership had a trickle-down effect, especially when they now show up in their leadership in our offices every 3 months asking, well, how are you doing here? That tends to change leadership's view of where this is on the priority scale, where a couple of years ago, we weren't a part of that discussion. I mean, we were part of, orphaned out in the IT shop. Well, now you've got to balance that risk to what we do out there in the airports and the nation's traveling public versus this, what could cause harm if we're a result of a cyber attack of some sort. So those conversations are now happening. So much different than last year, so I think there's a lot of goodness here. So it's how do we take advantage of that and make sure we don't overplay it. It's got to be a balanced risk versus operations, and we come with the right story and answer.
I think when you talk about silver linings, if there is any of all these breaches, and we're not just talking about OPM, but Target and JP Morgan Chase and go on and on, I think it's this understanding of the non-IT folks. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we can continue our conversation. You're listening to the panel discussion, Cyber Warfare, Securing Our Nation's Defense, sponsored by Tenable Network Security on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.